Well, I mean, on essence and personality, you wanted to talk about that?
Well, I suggested it, knowing it to be a topic of interest. I'm happy to talk about it to the
Sure.
extent of whatever knowledge I have, which is slight, but it might be interesting.
Well, with essence and personality, within the Gurdjieffan work, it's one of those ideas that never seemed to be of particular concern to people, but it's something that was just taken on board, despite being obviously problematic in any number of ways. And having just re-looked at or revisited my notes on Jean Vaysse, where he was especially clear there. He made the point you made in the email that essence involves the qualities and characteristics you're born with or somehow inherited in some way, not actually defined anywhere. And then personality is that which is acquired in life. The idea is that essence tends to grow to about the age of 6 or 7, then it becomes passive. Its growth ceases. Growth of personality then begins. And ultimately, it reaches the point where it begins to destroy essence or kill off essence. And so you have this report Ouspensky speaks of, seeing that many people were in fact inwardly dead, even though the outer body and the personality was still functioning. There is an experiment reported in Search of the Miraculous where Gurdjieff, with means unidentified, manages to hypnotize and switch off the personalities of two different characters. The first character he reports is sort of, if my memory serves me correctly here, he is a representative of the educated middle class. He's full of well-studied opinions about the war, about their events, and his particular manner. Again, if I recall properly, he's a voluble type and articulate too. The other man he hypnotizes, the other man whose personality switches off, is a young, argumentative type, I believe. Once personalities are switched off, the man of high culture and great opinion is essentially reduced to a simpleton. He creates very little impression amongst those who saw this experience, and he doesn't have opinions about anything when asked. He then sort of famously asks, he said, I'd like some raspberry jam, I think is what he asked for, requests. I think it was at this point the other gentleman chimes in, and he gives a contrary impression. He is in fact very awake. He's taking in all impressions. He's quite sharp, lucid. And he says, can't you see that this man is asleep? And what's interesting about this reported experiment is that I've never heard of a repeat, or I've never heard of something being tried by other people within the work. This would seem to be, to those people, they're quite a clear demonstration of this difference between essence and personality.
Well, I recall vaguely the passage in Search of the Miraculous that you mentioned, and would at least point out that, as far as my own recollection goes, in that book, which is basically a snapshot of Gurdjieff's views according to Ouspensky at around that time, essence, as far as I can recall, was never discussed by Gurdjieff in terms of something that might have been inherited, or, for example, something that might have even survived from a past life. The impression I got from where the distinction surfaces in the text was, if anything, it was a more practical psychology type of distinction, where everything that you just mentioned about the personality is, I think, basically true for Gurdjieff in the text. That it's extraneous, it's externally acquired, it's temporary, but that there is something underneath, the so-called essence, which is more fixed, more enduring, and of course is linked to the metaphor that he uses of crystallization. Something becomes crystallized and fixed. But I'm interested when you say that this Jean Vaysse character may have talked about essence in terms of something that is inherited or acquired from past lives, because of course that's the notion as it appears in Strieber. So it's possible that Strieber inherited the notion, this modified version of essence from other Gurdjieffans rather than arriving at it himself, which of course would mean that it's even less original for him. It's even more of an outright plagiarism or appropriation.
Yeah. Well, in terms of what I wrote, I said, you know, that's my association with essence and personality. What survives.
So you weren't referring to the Gurdjieffan, you were referring to what you had posted under the name just now.
Well, what I've said just now about essence and personality to this point refers to what I've read. In terms of its link to survival past life, no, it's not. The way I've presented it so clearly and boldly, it's not presented in any text that way. However, it does seem to be part of the oral tradition within the work. I've read accounts of people involved in the work in Britain and America where they will discuss past life in reference to essence and personality. That being said, you know, by definition, then that's not a mainstream idea. What's interesting to consider is the significance of developing essence. Essence is thought to be of the non-planetary level. It's of the solar level, which by definition originates from outside this world. And the idea is by making the essence active in one's life, you can develop that and build it to a point it's capable of surviving death. So the implication, even within the text, within what's written, within In Search of the Miraculous and within Beelzebub's Tales, is that, yeah, the essence is purposed towards surviving death. Where the Gurdjieffan ideas take issue with the standard presentation of reincarnation is, of course, the idea is that not everyone survives death because the lack of development of essence, which is associated with the development of these higher non-physical bodies.
Well, that's interesting. And it's interesting from the standpoint that you can see how a doctrine evolves, not only when it's exchanged and passed down, but even within the originators. You know, my exposure to Gurdjieff is only through Miraculous. And I recall fairly distinctly that when the question is put to him about surviving physical death, he is, I wouldn't say indifferent to it, but he leaves the door open, the possibility that, sure, maybe under certain circumstances, the essence can survive. But it's not a question that originates with him. Yeah. It's not his focus. It's not his concern. Somebody asks him because it's their own concern, and he gives a somewhat accommodating answer. But then if, as you say, later on in Beelzebub's Tales, for example, it's more explicitly drawn out, it could be that the question of surviving physical death acquired more prominence in his later thought. And certainly it stands to reason that when you move over to these other Gurdjieffans, the people who, for example, introduced meditation or were more interested in these other practices and so on, that the question of reincarnation and past lives and so on would automatically, naturally be of greater concern to them than perhaps it was to Gurdjieff himself. So you can see the question gaining prominence for that reason as well. I mean, the concerns of the other people who pass on the doctrine.
Yeah. Give you an instance of those concerns. You know, I read an account by someone who's involved in the Californian foundation for a number of decades, I believe. He wrote of how someone very close to Lord Pentland had claimed that Pentland had been formerly an Egyptian and an Atlantean in past lives. Now, that was, to me, an extraordinary detail as to how, such a report would have been made in the context of a teaching which, as you observed, doesn't put any particular emphasis on reincarnation. It is largely, strangely silent about that. The two things that I'd also say here is, one, in my time with the Gurdjieff work, I distinctly remember how confused discussion was on this topic of essence and personality. The Gurdjieffan ideas, of course, have an internal consistency and coherence, probably owes much maybe to just the capability of a lot of the original people involved. So they built up a literature which is, internally mannered in such way as to give, superficially credible and coherent answers to all such questions, with the memorable exception, in my experience at least, of this question of essence and personality. What exactly is what? And how it relates to the astral body and development of the higher centers, and what it means for a post-physical existence. The second point I'd like to make is to consider is how that confusion was manifested itself in Ouspensky's life. Ouspensky, at the very end of his life, made a real point of driving around England and sites of which have been significant to him in his earlier periods of his life, in order to sort of fix him in his memory, in order to avoid what he felt was his fate of recurrence. He thought he would simply be forced to live out everything again. And from what I understand is he got this idea from Nietzsche, I think it was. But as to the provenance of recurrence, I really can't speak.
Well, the idea of the so-called eternal recurrence, or the eternal recurrence of the same, is one that originates with Nietzsche. And as I recall, Ouspensky was a reader of Nietzsche, to be sure. But it seems to me that if he was driving around revisiting the locations of his youth in order to avoid a specifically Nietzschean eternal recurrence, that he was definitely bringing his own perspective to the concept. When you read in Nietzsche about the eternal recurrence idea, basically what he does is he proposes it as a thought experiment. What if, for example, you had to live out the same life again and again and again, an infinite number of times, in every detail, again and again and again, the eternal recurrence of the same? Would you be able to survive it? For Nietzsche, it was a question of affirmation, which was a central concept for him. What is your stance toward, or how do you cope with an existence, a life which is not necessarily one of suffering in some classic Christian sense, but one in which basically you're surrounded by the infinite on all sides, such that the amount of suffering in the universe is infinite, the amount of joy is infinite. There's a kind of equivalence between the two, therefore. In the face of the abyss, which is this abyss opened up in all directions with the death of God, so on and so forth, what is the reaction that you have? What is the stance that you take? And for him, in order to avoid the pitfalls of nihilism, he developed a language in a private sort of universe centering around affirmation, Dionysus, the dancer, being life-affirming, and so on. So for Nietzsche, certainly the concept of the eternal recurrence wasn't something that formed for him an actual description of things. It was more of a thought experiment that you could sort of use to test yourself by. Well, you know, have you thought of this? What would it be like if this were true? For Ouspensky to take it sort of literally means he's definitely coming at it from a different perspective.
Yeah, and to further complicate the picture, in the account I read of this, the author does admit that perhaps, and does admit or does include the remarks of some associated with Ouspensky, that this was more the idea of a certain Rodney Collins, who had latched on to Ouspensky in Ouspensky's later years as his prime student. And Ouspensky himself, according to those people who saw Collins' relationship to Ouspensky, those claimed that Ouspensky was simply too ill, really, to resist the enthusiasm of Collins in this effort. But it's uncertain. But it is known that Ouspensky was in his last months trying to make an effort to reach a different, higher state of consciousness. It's interesting, as an aside, he felt at that last point in his life that Gurdjieff's work and Gurdjieff's system had failed. He went as far as to say there is no system. And in a number of talks in London, he spoke to his old groups, and he spoke to substantial audiences there, dismissing the work and Gurdjieff. So it's an unsettled picture.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to me. I can see, Ouspensky was probably the most intelligent of the Gurdjieffians. And I can see how quite possibly his diagnosis of there being no system and being disenamored of it at the end could well have been accurate and legitimate. Because what I observe, again, with what little I know about it, having encountered some of the major themes and motifs associated with some of the major names, is that just like in any religion, it seemed to have been subject almost immediately to a kind of drift. There's a demonstration that you can see online anywhere, I think YouTube. It's a pretty common demonstration that teachers use when they want to talk about genetic drift, or when they try to explain evolution as a process of random mutation over time. What they'll do is they'll have a big, sort of like a whiteboard, but with all sorts of sheets of white paper on the front. You can flip over the back of it. And what they'll do is, if I'm describing it correctly, they'll invite a student to come up and draw a straight line on one of the pieces of paper. And I guess I should say that rather than starting at the top of a thick sheet of blank ones, I think they start at the bottom. So what happens is somebody draws a straight line with a ruler, and then the teacher will flip a page down, a new page over the one, and another student will be encouraged to come up and to trace that straight line. Yeah. And they do this again 20 or 30 times, and then you can compare the first line with the last. It's the same idea with the Chinese, the game they call telephone, where you got a bunch of kids sitting around in a circle. You start off in one place and you end up in a very different place. It seems almost inevitable with these social organizations, whether they're religions or cults or whatever you want to call them, spiritual groups, at the level of doctrine, it starts to mutate almost immediately. Again, in part because the founders or the original thinkers evolve over time as they age and they change their thinking, But then when new people come in, they want to leave their mark on it. They have their own original ideas. And these concepts drift. And whatever original insight may have been there, coming from the founder, in an effort to keep it all new and to keep it all going, it changes sufficiently so that in very short time, coming at it from a philosophical perspective, there is no coherent doctrine. You can't reconcile them. No. I mean, if you try to take the distinction between essence and personality that's presented in Miraculous, let's say in Gurdjieff in his, his main period there, or at least his early period, and reconcile it with later ones, in a way they're irreconcilable, because essence in the earlier formulations, it seems to me, has a lot to do with core personality, even regression in psychological terms. So if Gurdjieff says, for example, that the essence is formed by age 6, he's talking about childhood. And when he gives the example of the guy, or when he demonstrates with the guy who says he wants raspberry jam, what you're seeing there could be called a regression to like a more childish or childlike aspect. Mm. So what essence refers to in that case is something that you might say is more concrete and more easily observed among individuals. But then when you look at these later formulations, when you're talking about either a mystical one in which the essence is related somehow to the solar, or if you're talking about it from a more past life reincarnation-oriented perspective, how do you reconcile that with the essence being fixed by age 6, or how do you reconcile it with the childlike character? So that distinction already just starts to drift. It starts to change. And probably all the other ones are subject to the same thing. So then what doctrine is there? What do you actually follow? What ends up happening is people pick and choose based on their affinities and their sympathies, and then they resent it when others choose differently, and then you have sects. You have sectarianism, you have conflict and splinter groups and so on. And then nobody's got a coherent doctrine. They've all sort of become militant around a shifting set of metaphors that differs from the other body metaphors held by the other group.
Well, let's say two separate things. I think when we talk about essence and personality, I mean, the fact that one of the gentlemen seemed to regress and became, obviously immature and childlike, stands in contrast to what happened with the other man, who seemingly became much more mature and alert and conscious. So their essence were quite different in their development that pertains. And the development of essence is a key goal of the work, because by its understanding, it's not so much that it's fixed by the age of 6 or 7, it's that its development is arrested. And then from there on, personality begins to grow and grow in its place. And the hope of the work then is to arrest the further development of the personality, prevent its crystallization or reverse its crystallization, to allow the growth of essence to resume. That's the theory. In terms of the fragmentation of the work, it's actually spectacularly true with the Gurdjieff work. It breaks apart within years of his death. The first generation students are largely at odds. The leading lights are strongly in disagreement. Bennett was kicked out of the London Society. Andersons were kicked out of the New York Foundation. Anne Severly, she went her own way, opposed to Pentland. Jeanne de Salzman, if reality of being is any indicator, developed her own take on the work, which incidentally ignored many of the elements that were critical to Ouspensky, say. So if you read Reality of Being, which is drawn from her own private notebooks, reflecting on her own work, the cosmology and history advanced by Gurdjieff is of no concern. And in fact, she uses an obviously different language and languaging than Gurdjieff himself used, either as presented in Search of the Miraculous or Beelzebub's Tales. And so, yeah, it fragments and splinters, and it's replete with all the sort of pathetic politics you would expect. It does remind one of, think of Kissinger's remark about student politics. He said it's so savage because the prize is so small. The Gurdjieff work, broke into dozens of subsections. Willem Nyland too. He went his own way, and each group believing that they themselves are the representatives of the true faith. I can give you a personal anecdote on that. Forgive me if I've said this before, but I got in touch with Russell Huff, a student of Paul Anderson, and he told me quite explicitly, is that ultimately the work or any spiritual development is a guru yoga. You need to have a relationship with someone who's reached the goal, who is themselves developed. And that explained why Anderson folded his group, into the hands of a Tibetan Zazen teacher, rather than hand them into the care of the New York Foundation. Now, when I mentioned this to my group leader, he said, "Oh, that's ridiculous. No, that's not true at all." And so there you have it. I have it as, albeit it's a secondhand observation, but it's contradicted by the secondhand information of someone else who is, in their way, in a direct line from Gurdjieff himself.
Yeah, well, you see it taking place everywhere. For example, in something as different as psychoanalysis, the exact same thing happened. You had Freud, then you had a couple of major luminaries who thought that they were going to correct Freud and correct his defects, people like Jung and Adler and others who went off and did their own thing. And then, of course, Freud's daughter, Anna Freud, came up, and then she had her own ideas. And the massive splintering, sectarianism, each around a certain set of doctrines, concepts, core ideas that persisted over generations. And the ideas simply die out, or they are mutated into other ideas that really don't, strictly speaking, have any similarity ultimately to the originals. And it's endless, it's endless fragmentation. And there's not much that people can do about it.
No, and I think it's directly related to the complexity of the teaching. It seems that with Gurdjieff, he tried a number of different approaches. So that period when he taught in that sort of systematic, quasi-academic way of, extensive lectures, and he built out that body of ideas as presented by Ouspensky, that approach wasn't repeated at later stages. Like in Search of the Miraculous is a report of a time. At later stages, the emphasis seems to be on, on movements, on physical work, this, that, and the other. And, as a result then, that when people are trying to present the teaching, it's the sheer complexity of the teaching mitigates strongly against its faithful reproduction. So I think for people like Jean de Salzman or Ouspensky, it's not so much that they're presenting what they take to be Gurdjieff's teaching. They're presenting the only part of Gurdjieff's teaching they could actually reproduce. So there's an obvious drift then takes place. And what confuses matters is that with the Gurdjieff work, unlike academic subjects, is the difference between theory and practice doesn't obtain. And so as people develop whatever that means then, is that their own take on work and how to practice changes, and they themselves, whatever emphasis they place on what they know, it will change and evolve in time. So having looked at that and having been struck by the sectarianism and the fragmentation of the Gurdjieffan work, I'm struck by the contrast, say, with Buddhism, with Zen, say, which succeeds in replicating itself, it seems, quite faithfully. I think in no small part because of the sheer simplicity of the ideas there. A few core ideas, they're easily reproduced, easily understood, it's difficult to misrepresent them. And then there's a practice associated with that, which is simple and direct. It's not this task, there's no groups, none of this. It's simply shikantaza, meditate, or meditate with a cone, one or the other. So it's simpler and allows, a more faithful reproduction.
Well, I agree with you to an extent, but I guess in one respect I don't agree. What you refer to as complexity, it seems to me might be better put as lack of intelligibility or lack of immediate intelligibility, because complexity has to do, for example, with quantity and the number of relationships among notions. But you can have a maximum of misunderstanding and an infinite number of interpretations of a very simple or vague notion. In fact, this is part of the problem, since most of these doctrines are transmitted, at least in part, through words. Words have different associations with everybody, and they label different raw experiences. So if a doctrine had as its only principle, let's say, God is love, you could still imagine, even with that simplicity, over the span of 1,000 or 2,000 years, hundreds of competing groups, each with different interpretations, some convinced that in order to bring about God's love, you have to behead people, others who think you have to plant flowers, so on and so forth. So at the level of the doctrine, the complexity of the concepts may not be as much at issue as the degree to which people are allowed to engage in their own interpretation of these concepts. And that's sort of a different thing. If something like Buddhism has been successful in its transmission to the extent that it has been, it could be, to put it in slightly different terms than you just did, that there's greater force used in a sense, or that for some other set of reasons, practitioners of Buddhism are not encouraged or allowed, or they don't find the opportunity to reinvent the wheel in the way that people are encouraged or find themselves able to when it comes to something like a brand new thing like the Gurdjieff work, or something like psychoanalysis, or all these variety of other things, where people somehow are able to become aspirants. They can aspire to replace the master and come up with their own great new doctrine. Sometimes they'll claim that it's just, they're just rediscovering the core doctrine and that it's been corrupted by others, when in fact all it is a reinvention, really. So they take these terms, these motifs, these signifiers of language, and they try to apply them to their own experience, their own life experience as best they can. Now there's a crucial distinction to be made there too, because when you have the founder of one of these social practices, somebody like a Gurdjieff, his doctrine, to the extent that it's intelligible at all to others, it nevertheless arises organically out of his life, his experience, and it's there where it's most meaningful. And when somebody develops a set of concepts and distinctions and maybe associates them with physical practices, an integrated system that really sums up in in an unusual way, their own life experience. I think that is discernible to other people. And that's why such a person acquires followers. They see the power, the mastery that comes with that. Here's a guy who's devised his own system. His system is a reflection, a thorough reflection of his life. All of these intangible moments that add up to the life, to add up to who he is. So he's acquired a kind of mastery as a result. Now they aspire to similar mastery over themselves, but they try to obtain it by going through his doctrine. And the people closest to the original founder, the first followers, they're at the epicenter of it because they are physically closest to that mastery. But then as you go over time or across distance, your proximity to that mastery fades, and so people they come to the doctrine as more of an artifact, as an externality. They find the books, or they encounter the doctrine through readings, or they're shaking the hand that shook the hand of the founder. They're at a remove. And that's a further inducement to try and reinvent the wheel, because they know that based on legend and story and so on, that at its founding, this was a very powerful doctrine. A lot of people were drawn to it. But they also intuitively sense that, well, geez, now, here it's 60 years on, and here I am in California, and yeah, I'm interested in this doctrine, but it's not as alive as it was. So how do I recapture that which I'm seeking? Well, I do one of two things. Either I go in a totally original way, in which I say, yes, this is an original modification or variation on the doctrine, or I claim it's a rediscovery, where I go back and I isolate key concepts and I say, well, these have been lost, or these have been corrupted. Still, though, again, it's the same thing that the original founder did. You are advancing a new doctrine or a modified doctrine that comes out of your own experience, that somehow sums up the intangibles of your own life as much as possible, and the degree to which it does is the degree to which it's powerful and appealing. But the cycle just keeps going. The doctrine becomes more and more garbled. More and more people try to rediscover it when really they're looking for the power that it originally offered, and so they force it to transform. And sooner or later, one or the other, it becomes totally unrecognizable to itself, and probably would be unrecognizable to the original founder.
Well, yeah, it's funny. Just before you called, I mean, this sort of discussion here is being, the themes here have been on my mind. I'm rereading David Gurdjieff's account of his time with the Gurdjieff Work. It's called On a Spaceship with Beelzebub. And I read it with that sort of series of minor shudders of recognition, where I see certain deficits of character driving a commitment to the Gurdjieff Work. And these are deficits in character, weaknesses in personality, I'm not sure how to frame it, that I recognize in myself. My own experience with the Gurdjieff Work recently has been of increased distance. Obviously, that will be a critical distance, but a distance in emotionally, but even viscerally. I'm looking at something I just don't understand anymore, in that I don't understand in how others can understand it and appreciate it. It just doesn't seem to be particularly effective in delivering on its claims, to the point where you could question, is it effective at all? Or if not, in fact, only effective in delivering the opposite of what it would want. The irony is, this is happening at a time when my own spiritual practice has never been richer. but it itself is a fairly boiled down, simple approach. It's really only defined by the intensity of the effort I'm making there. And it's associated with, I think, some genuine renovation of my character and maybe some real emergence into myself and my life.
Well, it's interesting.
Yeah. I think if I can just add one thing. I know I'm rambling, but the idea I'm coming to is that very, very few people, or it is rare for people to actually want transformation. What more often than not it would seem is that they have embryonic desires that are hidden from themselves and they don't quite understand. And the contact with a teaching and a doctrine and a group or institution like the Gurdjieff Work lets these very human desires, very human, ordinary needs, they allow them to develop and find full expression. And these desire needs would be a simple desire for people to assert themselves in life, to find some avenue of social dominance, to have the security of a knowingness that's unavailable from other parts of life. And you can see this as you read the literature closely. Even this book I'm talking about, he speaks about the politics and the obvious warped personalities associated with the hierarchy of the New York and California foundations. Those people, of course, would imagine themselves to be a spiritual elite, representative of humanity's evolutionary age. And not only do I find myself denying that idea, rejecting that idea, but I wonder if it is not in fact the case that these people are, and people associated with things like the work, are more like people you find in more like political ideologues. That their minds are, narrow and poorly functioning. They lack a genuine capacity to observe life intelligently. They don't generate any particularly cogent insight into their own living. But instead, what they do is they grab an ideology, albeit it's a non-political one, and then they just sort of try and impose the patterns they find there into their own life. And so it's something that's much more representative of a mass mind than an actually properly individuated one.
Well, I think that comment is precisely on point. Moreover, that you could set this charge at the feet of every doctrine. In other words, you could point to it as a direct failing of that doctrine. I mean, what good are the insights of the Gurdjieff work if it so quickly becomes just a social practice subject to individual whims and fancies and rivalries and so on, like every other? In other words, if you set forth some sort of set of doctrines and practices that you say are designed to liberate the individual from these limitations, specifically in the case of Gurdjieff, with all the emphasis on the automaton, the human being acting without thinking, without being awake, being asleep, basically being subject utterly to its own invisible principles, its own mechanical desires that are unexamined and so on. Well, for any doctrine that's put forward that offers liberation, but specifically for one in the same category as the Gurdjieff work, where it identifies these particular problems as one of thoughtlessness and acting automatically without insight, being subject to forces that you don't understand, and therefore you are limited and enslaved and so on. For it to so immediately and transparently fail in precisely what it sets out to do, I mean, that's a direct charge. That's a serious charge that you can lay at the feet of such a doctrine, because it not only fails generally, but it fails specifically in avoiding what it sets out to avoid.
You know, as an aside, it means something a little separate from this is, I found myself on Quora. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that website, but this is where people, can ask questions, and then there are all sorts of, everybody is free to chime in on answers. And I returned to this website with a view of trying to, again, read up on a particular account of higher consciousness that I found especially interesting. As I did so, I found myself laughing to myself as I remembered reading the answers to a question which was along the lines of, who is the most remarkable man you've ever met? Now, Quora, strangely, is beloved of Indians. An enormous number of answers are from Indians. There are, obvious cultural and sociological reasons why Indians embrace the opportunity to be in authority. But what made me smile wryly to myself was my memory of the responses to who's the most remarkable man you met. All these Indians had chimed in, and they told the story in exactly the same way, which is, they would talk about some guy in the third person. He did this, and he did that, and he overcame poverty, and he got educated here, and he got educated there, and he was in the army, dun, 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 dun. And then at the end, in screaming cap letters, they would write, and this man is my father, right? So, what I found remarkable was this sort of, the style reproduced itself again and again and again, which was, I'm not sure what to make of it, but I took it as being emblematic of maybe a mass mind, something. It said of, less developed countries is that people are fundamentally less individuated, and well, there may be something to that. And so, I did smile at this. But then I thought too, people involved in the work, there's the equivalence. There's the equivalent sort of style and set behavior and what's expected and what can be said and what cannot be said. And its own, much more limited and localized way, it's a third world culture. That it's not producing anything that could be of genuine interest, even just on the human level.
Well, you mentioned a bit ago how it is that very few people seem to want to pursue a spiritual path, or one of, whether you call it enlightenment or liberation and so on, while the majority seem just to have a set of inchoate desires and aspirations. They might know that they're unhappy or that they're lacking something, but that doesn't necessarily lead to the choice of some sort of spiritual path, or even sort of that set of concrete practices. For example, you could see any number of movements within the broader self-help movement as sort of spiritual practices without the spirituality. You know, a set of techniques and practices that are designed to, lessen the sense of dissatisfaction and so on and so forth. But anyway, it caused me to think, number one, why would you want a spiritual path? In a sense, it's begging the question. We might simply assume that it's better to do so. It's better to want more or to want something different. That's something that would need to be examined. But secondly, the more general question follows, and that is, why do people want anything at all? Why do they want what they want? And that question, as broadly put as it is, seems to me to lie at the heart of the matter when it comes to the inevitable failings and dysfunctionality of these groups that organize themselves even around a spiritual goal, a spiritual ideal. Why do people want what they want? Why do they either want one thing or not want it, or want something else? I mean, after all, you see certain recurring patterns. I mean, you mentioned these Indians who tell a sort of legend of someone who rose from nothing into success, and that was my father.
In all
Well,
cap
there's
letters.
a fundamental, yeah, in all caps. Well, I mean, that's a pretty fundamental recurring pattern, I think. The relationship between the son and the father. Anyway, it puts me in mind of Lacanian psychoanalysis, which is something that, unfortunately, I know a bit about, although I have very uneasy feelings about it, and I certainly would not call myself a Lacanian or approach it as a set of doctrines that need to be advanced. But I would point out that just like the Gurdjieff work, and just like a variety of religions and so on, Lacanian psychoanalysis, for example, is both theory and practice. It's a set of concepts, it's a set of arguments, signifiers, and it's also a social practice that takes place, usually between two people. But what's interesting about psychoanalysis as it's practiced in the Lacanian mold is that it expressly sets itself up in order to avoid the transmission of a doctrine per se. In other words, and this is just by the by, it's a sort of interesting point. When you enter into a Lacanian psychoanalysis, the analyst is trained and goes to every length possible to remain a sort of blank slate onto which you can project your own assumptions and fantasies and everything else. The analyst goes out of his or her way to not give you any kind of answers that you can cling to or build some sort of notion around. In other words, that practice in this particular form of psychoanalysis is designed in a way to frustrate this tendency that appears to be universal to find agreement, to construct a shared reality that provides comfort and security, but then at the same time leads to aggression and when it's threatened and so on and so forth. And it's the explicit arc of the treatment. I mean, this is spelled out in the doctrine, that basically you go through an analysis for however many years you go through it. And all you end up doing is you circle, as they call it, the real. You traverse the fantasy. So as that analyst sits there over all these years, intervening only to say a word here or to ask a question there, what you in fact are doing is you are crossing all of the fantasy space that you're capable of generating. You're going through all the permutations of this reality that you keep trying to construct in this setting. And every time you construct a reality, a partial reality, something that you think you're willing to invest in, and when it's not reciprocated by the analysts, it basically is smacked down. It falls down. Until at the end of the analysis, whenever that is, which is sort of something that you only discover yourself, you realize, oh, this has all just been me the whole time. I mean, all I've been doing, without ever really being aware of it, is successively hallucinating this and this and this and this and this, until the gesture of that hallucination becomes so repetitive.
It's obvious.
That you, yeah, but not in terms of its content, because the content is always hallucination. Human desire is always about hallucination. There's no right desire, in other words. There's no reality versus the hallucination that that you're supposed to come to as some sort of realization. No, it's just the gesture becomes so regularized that you can begin to discern the gesture as such, and you, in the end, identify with the gesture. You become reconciled to that as what you have been doing all along.
And when you say, just if I can ask a question for clarification, when you say the gesture, you're talking about a particular idiosyncratic response to circumstances that is taken initially as a given, but through the exploration of these gestures and instances of the gestures, it then becomes apparent that this gesture is but one of many possible gestures. And it is an obvious contingency which then strips it of its libidinal power in the life of somebody.
In a way.
Yeah.
I mean, you could take a more concrete example. This is, sounds very trivial and, cliche. It's a bit too obvious today. But let's say that you're a guy who enters into all these failed relationships always with a blonde woman. So like you've had 3 wives, and the first wife was a blonde who had her hair a certain way. The second was a blonde who had her hair the same way. The third was a blonde who had her hair the same way. And the relationship always ends in disaster, and it's always sort of the same. Let's say, though, that for some reason, even though this is a cliched example, let's suppose it happened 50 years ago when people were less savvy about these particular patterns. Let's say you didn't realize that you were just doing the same thing again and again and again. Now, that is a specific example. What happens in a Lacanian psychoanalysis is that desire as such, in all its permutations, not just in a specific instance which is sort of obvious, but everything you put forward, either as a way you want yourself to be seen or the way you reject something in someone else, or all of these things are all expressions of a desire, and they all, almost at a transcendental level, all have the same form, in a sense. Whatever the content, they have the same form. And you only, it's difficult to explain, because how can you become aware of a form without content?
Yeah. Well, it's like it's a template. It's a core pattern in consciousness which just replicates itself in the different levels and aspects of life. Is that what you mean?
Yes, but even more broadly and generally than that, because you have to take into account that in psychoanalysis, a lot of desire, in fact, maybe the better part of it, is unconscious. Why you have the desire, what the cause is of the desire, where it comes from, none of this is accessible to ordinary consciousness. Maybe your rationales are accessible. Maybe the rationales that you generate, the self-justifications and so on, those are accessible. But as you go through a psychoanalysis, and this is simply the way they practice it, again, this is all I'm saying, it's not simply you as you see yourself becoming aware of certain patterns, but rather your unconscious also works through you. And in its effort to generate desire and to project and to hallucinate its wishes, you become aware of a pattern that is so general, but also is within you in a sense without you realizing it in the most broad and general way. That's what you become in a successful analysis accommodated to. This almost nameless style of desiring that through endless repetitions you finally dimly begun to perceive. So it's not so much any specific life instance. It's not so much any particular set of problems you have in your life, although those are included. But it's much broader than that. You can see it and understand it in a way by analogy with, like, the example of, let's say, the guy who has his 3 failed marriages always to blonde-haired women. And oh, by the way, it turns out his mother, when she was young, was blonde and had her hair that way, or whatever it is. But you work out that you play this game of repetition to such an extent over such a period of time that the you that you weren't aware of surfaces in a sense, almost as a structure, and you become aware of the structure. You become aware in a sense of this formula that you are without you ever having realizing it or having realized it. And it includes not only the big obvious things, but all the small, subtle things as well.
Oh, yeah. It's an interesting view, and I think there's profound insight there. Like, I notice, it's purely anecdotal, but it's how I relate to what you're saying right now, is that I've just seen in the last few weeks and months, virtually every aspect of my life changing, and particularly what's particularly obvious to me is that my thinking about so many things is changing and has changed. And one thing I find especially interesting has been my past interest in spirituality and spiritual doctrines. And what strikes me, even just banally, is that I've spent an enormous amount of time and energy there. And right now, I'd have to admit, my sense of it is that the return on investment has been extraordinarily poor. I wonder, and it's a waste of time to speculate like this, is that whatever gains I've made in terms of emotional development, interpersonal development, intrapersonal development, spirituality, if we could isolate that, I wonder, could those gains not have been more easily secured in the way most people go about pursuing these things, which is through genuinely satisfying personal relationships, which I've largely failed to build. A genuinely satisfying and engaging professional life, which I'd have to admit I've essentially failed to secure. And so, I wonder about my own life, what's going on there. I caught sight of myself in relation to somebody, and I saw a certain childishness in myself, and I just wonder, is there this sort of profound, embossed immaturity in my being? And what I have to relate to that, sadly or truthfully, is the idea I once came across that alcoholism serves to delay and prevent emotional development. Is that binge drinking tends to arrest what is in ordinary emotional processing. So I wonder, is there just sort of, has there been a very real retardation in my youth, in my formative years, that manifested itself in my young adulthood, in my interest in the esoteric and the like, and also that sort of sense of having that the world itself was fundamentally an unstable and a collapse-prone place.
Well, I would say to that everybody always has only a partial view of themselves, and that when your view of yourself crumbles and that view begins to be replaced by another view, the good news or the bad news, depending on how you want to look at it, is that you're replacing one partial view that doesn't cover the whole picture with another partial view that doesn't cover the whole picture. I think this is true in an ultimate sense, although it may not be immediately true in each case, because the mind leaps to a meaningful reality. That is its refuge, and that reality, in order for it to function, has to feel total. It has to feel like it covers all of the facts. And yet it seems as if in reality, which is something that nobody can ever grasp in its entirety, you're always more than you are. There are always other reasons for you doing things than perhaps you're aware. And so something might be partly true, or true to some extent, but when you form a new view of yourself or a view of your past and so on, it's as much a reflection of the present, at least as much a reflection of your present circumstances, as it is any kind of accurate depiction of the past. I mean, anytime you come to, a sort of crossroads where you reevaluate yourself, I think almost in every case, you could, if you wanted to, point to recent circumstances that could well have been simply accidental, that have really full responsibility for this new reevaluation. In other words, if you had a certain outlook and approach for years and years before, and now all of a sudden that approach or outlook doesn't work, in general, you don't have to look very far into your recent history to see one or two important events that are ultimately really responsible for this new reevaluation. So what is it? Is it that you had a false view before that is now being replaced by a true view? Or is it simply that this new constructed truth is a reflection of your circumstances? In a way, both are true, but you can't just stick with the one, because even that's not fully accurate. I mean, if you've had negative experiences with, for example, the Gurdjieff group in recent years, and then now you find yourself wondering whether not only the spiritual path might have been a waste, but whether other things that are sort of like by implication might also be true. This is a new view, but it's a partial one, and it's triggered by life circumstances. That doesn't make it less valid, but it also gives you some extra freedom if you can recognize that. If you can say, well, not only is this reevaluation of past facts that I'm undertaking now true to the best of my ability, but there are also some pretty obvious reasons why this is happening now and are shaping and causing my reevaluation. So when I hear you say, for example, that maybe, if I understood you right, years of getting pleasantly drunk might have caused emotional retardation, a slowing of emotional maturity, and that maybe, therefore, lower emotional maturity was what prolonged this futile or unrewarding spiritual path. It's a chain of inferences. You're saying, well, if this is true, then maybe this is true, and then maybe this is true. Ultimately, the real trigger is just, recent life experiences. So that would need to be taken into account as well.
Yeah, I can't dispute what you're saying there. It's true. I mean, it's I take what you're saying is it's a necessary moderation and qualification to to my ideas. I think that it's strange. I suppose what makes the moment striking to myself is that I can't really recall at any other point in my life I've been brought to such a total reevaluation of all that makes up my life. It seems to be strangely singular in that fashion. I mean, sure, recent circumstances have, triggered this moment, but as you say, it's no less valid for that.
You almost have to maintain a kind of double vision, if I could just say, because the tendency is to go one way or the other. The tendency is either to reject a reevaluation because all it is caused, quote unquote, by recent events, or to be completely blind and unaware of the role of recent events and to go full in for the reevaluation, I would suggest, to the extent that I could offer any advice at all, is to try to keep both in view at the same time, because with the added flexibility, there's added freedom, and you're less caught in wherever your reevaluation might lead.
Yeah, and I mean, and the other conclusion you draw from any such reevaluation is a sort of very simple inference: is that, well, I was wrong once, I could be wrong again. So because the conclusions I tended to draw about my experience were, necessarily and obviously incomplete, that would suggest that perhaps a similar effort will produce similar results. And as you say, it gives you a certain freedom when you remember that. It just, we're arriving at that point, arriving at one of my favorite quotes, William Goldman in Ventures in the Screen Trade. He said of Hollywood, he says, no one knows anything. And it's, and for all these great doctrines and all the energies expended there, it would seem is that there's little return on investment. You can't say that the New York Foundation, for instance, is churning out hundreds and thousands of, notably developed people, or that Lacanian psychoanalysis is curing the world of its ills. It's a strange picture. And I have to imagine an extraterrestrial perspective on it all. That suppose these more advanced beings, like their take on things. Just one primitive gesture among another.
Yeah, it could be. Or it could be that their advanced view is also just a partial one, and that, you know, a lot of their beliefs about spirituality and so on may ultimately be as shaped by their own history and accidental circumstance as ours. We don't know yet. When it comes to life in general, something that's occurred to me is that you really cannot compare your life with someone else's, because everyone's life is its own separate universe in a sense. And to the extent that that's true, you can't really evaluate your life against hypotheticals. So, you know, if I had done such and such, well, that never happened. And it's a totally different category. There's only one life, and that's what has happened. And each person's life is that stream of things happening. And the things that didn't happen don't exist. They're not real. And for that reason, in a way, a comparison is impossible. Just as it's impossible to compare one person's life with another, absolutely, it's impossible within one person to compare his life to how it might have been.
I mean, that's true. I mean, the experiment can't be repeated. The circumstances can't be recreated. But I suppose what I have been saying is just emerging what I would take to be a very, very human, very common habit to speculate about the meaning of one's life. You know,
No question.
You know, I'd imagine what advice I'd say try and provide my own children. My son, you know, speak of him because he'll be a man too, and I suppose I might be able to offer better advice there than to my daughter. But it's a strange experience just to notice that all that I've sort of taken as a given, or all these things I've been interested in that have made up my life, it seems to be passing through my hand like sand through my fingers. And I feel that I think, you know, the observation that some of the best experiments fail. And it's not that I'm necessarily regretful or especially regretful about things. I felt like I've learned an awful lot, but it seems to just all come to very little. And my experience is hardly unique, and it's much more common than I'd say that most people see. I can think of people I know who imagine themselves to be, their lives to be rich with their achievements, but those achievements themselves are often grand hallucinations. So it just seems to be an aspect of the human condition. We sort of circle right round, or we move in ever decreasing circles till we come back to this point of simple existence and simple awareness in it, having a non-reflective aspect that we have to honor.
Well, I agree. I come back though to you know, your comment about and the way that you framed it, at least you know, years of drinking or whatever.
Yeah.
You know, I think that one of these human tendencies that we have, especially today, and maybe it's unavoidable, is to express feelings in terms of facts. And what I mean is, you may feel a particular way about something today, and that feeling gets expressed in terms of an evaluation or a set of judgments that are framed or posed as facts. But in a way, there's a translation process going on, the same type of translation process you might go from translating German to English. In other words, at this moment, you might feel a particular way about drinking. And that feeling ends up getting translated and expressed in terms of factual statements where you say, well, did I waste so many years? Or maybe I was emotionally stunted because of the drinking. These are all sort of factual in the form that these statements take, even if not expressed with absolute certainty. They're still expressed in a sort of factual language. And it might be simply safer to say, for example, right now at this point in my life, I feel such and such about drinking, or I feel in such and such a way about spiritual practice. Because when you pose things as facts in order to reflect your feelings at a given moment, then the facts sort of cry out for inferences and implications which may not be strictly true. And then the picture that you create that gets formed has distortions.
That's a very acute insight, I have to say. It seems to me to be absolutely correct.